Okay, welcome everyone as we're recording for the Erev Yom Tov, Erev Shavuos, Erev Matan Torah, the last day of the Shloshes Me'Hagbala, as we start the second parak of Gittin in the Mishna Yomis with Mishna Aleph and Mishna Beis, sponsored by the Fish family, Lili Nishma Spasi Bas Rabbi, Shlomo ben Avram Alevi, Perel Bas Ruvain, Lili Nishma Shlomo ben Mordechai, for Shalem Fel Yomish Mechai Sar, for the schus of Avram Yom Benish ben Malki Yehudis and family, by Yoel Klugman and family for their Parnasa Gesundheit and Nachas, for Meir ben Chaya Sarah, Avigdor Aryeh ben Rivka. So remember we said that if you bring a get from overseas, you have to say B'fanei nichtav, B'fanei nechtam, before me it was written, before me it was signed. This was because when bringing it, let's say, from New York to Eretz Yisrael, if the husband claims a forgery, it would need to, the witnesses would need to be authenticated, and nobody in Eretz Yisrael will know the witnesses from New York. So therefore they believe the shliach as two, and therefore when he says B'fanei nechtam, it doesn't need to be authenticated. Now, in order that we shouldn't think and make a mistake that one witness is enough to authenticate other documents, we also necessitate that the witness should say B'fanei nechtam, before me it was written. If he can't say that, it's no good. And therefore our Mishnah says, I may be getting this if a Shliach brings a get from overseas, he says before me it was written, but he doesn't say before me it was signed. That defeats the purpose. He has to give testimony on the signatures. Or he says before me it was signed, it wasn't written before me. That's no good because like we said, he has to say before me it was written to differentiate it from other documents. Or if he says B'fanei nichtav kulei, in front of me was written the whole thing, but B'fanei nechtam chetzi, I only saw one signature, that's not good. Or B'fanei nichtav chetzi, before me was written half. We shouldn't explain the latter half, the typhus, the boilerplate part, but the tairif, his name, our name, the name of the city, the date he didn't see, that such a get is possible. Now, echad amar B'fanei nichtav, the echad amar B'fanei nechtam. If let's say the shliach of the get, Shimon, says in front of me it was signed, somebody else comes along and says he saw that it was written, that's possible. Because the shliach, who we believe like Beitrei, he's the one that has to say B'fanei nichtav also. Shnayim omer B'fanei nichtav, even if two say in front of us it was written, but ve'echad amar B'fanei nechtav, the shliach says in front of me it was signed, it's the shliach that also has to say that in front of me it's written, and therefore it's possible. Rabbi Yehuda says, there, since we have two witnesses that say in front of us it was written, and normally we don't necessitate that, that will show that this is different than other documents. And by other documents, you need to have two witnesses to authenticate it. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda Machshir, but the halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda. Finally, echad omer B'fanei nichtav, if one says in front of me it was written, but shnayim omer B'fanei nechtam, but two people say in front of us it was signed, so they are in fact authenticating the shtar by each one saying that they recognize the two signatures, which would be good by any other document, and therefore that's kosher. And now we're going to talk about predated shtaros. Now normally predated shtaros are no good, because if you have a predated shtar, so then the one that holds the shtar could collect from mortgage properties from the date of the shtar. But since the date is not accurate because it was signed the next day, so he would be collecting from mortgage properties illegally. Now, by a get, there could be one of two reasons. So first, if the get was written in the day and signed on the day, so that's not predated. If it was written at night and signed at night, that's also not predated. Even balayla, if it was written in the night, and signed the next day, since the night before is part of the next day, those are not predated. That's kosher. By yom, if it was written in the day, v'nechta balayla, and signed in the night, so that means it had yesterday's date, so it's predated. that's possible. Now the Tanna Kama says it's possible because we're afraid that maybe the husband might marry his niece, and she'll commit adultery, but because it's his niece, he'll have mercy on her and will want to cover up for her. So he'll predate the get from before her adultery and sign it after the adultery, and then say she was divorced when she did the adultery. So therefore it's possible. Reb Shimon Machshir. Reb Shimon holds we're not worried about covering up for adultery. Adultery is a real thing. And if there is adultery, usually the husband won't want to cover up, so that's not what we're worried about. We're worried about a different problem. That if you predate it, maybe if the husband sold some of his wife's nichsei malug when they're married, if it's predated, she might pull out the date and say that what he sold, he had no right to sell because they're already divorced. But they weren't divorced, it's predated. But we're not worried about that because Reb Shimon holds that once he decides to divorce her, in other words, once he writes a get, he's already not allowed to sell her nichsei malug, even if they're not divorced. So therefore we're not worried that she could claim illegally that they were divorced already, even though they weren't divorced until when it was signed, because he really isn't allowed to sell her nichsei malug once he sets his eye to divorce her, and therefore as soon as the get is written, he's already not allowed to sell her nichsei malug. And therefore, Reb Shimon Machshir, Reb Shimon Aimer, Kol Gittin shenichtavu b'yom v'nechtamu b'layla, all documents that are predated are psulim, because like we said, we don't want a person to be able to illegally collect from mortgage properties before he's allowed to. Chutz megitei nashim, he's not worried about the reason of adultery, and he's not worried that she's going to claim that he illegally sold her nichsei malug because of the date of the shtar, and really he sold it legally because they're not divorced until the next day when it was signed. We're not worried about that because he's not allowed to sell the nichsei malug once he writes a get, once he sets his eye to divorce her. And these were not easy Mishnayos. I want to thank you all for joining us and wish you a wonderful Yom Tov.